In the same way, we don't attribute free will to volcanoes or hurricanes or earthquakes or even animals when we try to address whatever damage that they've caused in our lives. We should extend that perspective to other people because we're all a part of this causal world. The fact that we're humans does not preclude us from that chain of cause and reaction that embodies the world as we know it. When I first heard the idea that free will is an illusion, I thought that is such a ridiculous statement. What do you mean free will is an illusion? Are you trying to tell me that I'm not making a decision to sit down here right now? Are you telling me that I'm not making a decision to pick up this pen right now? So initially, I met the idea with a lot of skepticism. But in time, I came to realize that the arguments for why free will is an illusion are just too strong to be ignored. I first came across this idea from Sam Harris, who is an influential neuroscientist, philosopher, and podcaster. And he really impressed upon me just how cogent the arguments are. It was such a counterintuitive idea to hold in my head. Every fiber of my being seemed to want to argue against that. But I hope you would keep an open mind while I try to present you with some of these arguments, and not just from Sam Harris, because I've read different articles and opinions about the idea of free will and had different conversations with people in person to try to see what counter arguments I might not have considered myself. And even after doing so, I still have not found enough reason to doubt the idea that free will is an illusion. So, what is free will? On a subjective level, free will feels like what it means to make a conscious decision to do something or not to do something. The fundamental claim that's being made about why free will is an illusion is that for any process to happen, it requires a long chain of events that preceded it. If I decided to pick up this pen right now, it feels like I deliberately, consciously decided to pick it up. So why is that an illusion? For one, I could have chosen any other object besides this pen, but for whatever reason, this pen was what my feelings decided that was going to be a better object to use. Granted, I could say that, well, it was a more relatable thing to use, but why was that just relatable enough for me to decide on that? Why did I not decide to use a remote control or a microphone? Of all the things that I could have found to be relatable to use as an example, I picked this pen. The intent to pick up that pen was spurred by every neuronal process that happened in my brain at the precise moment that it did to finally end up in that action. I don't get to control how my neurons are firing. They're doing whatever they're doing based on the neuron upstream to that and everything else that preceded that. So, to really demonstrate that free will is not an illusion, one has to find an uncaused cause. One has to find a cause that was not preceded by something else, but rather by a free agency to make that decision, right? And that's something that no one can find. On a subjective level, it might feel like the closer one gets to the action of, say, picking up a pen, the more that sense of free will seems to be in effect. It feels like even if I have no control over my genes, even if I have no control over my neurons firing at whatever point they decide to fire, I still made that final decision to pick up the pen. But I think this is a confusion that tries to differentiate intent from action. And while those are two different things, we need to realize that every action emanates from a thought. And to have an intent is to have something that is beyond the purview of free will because we do not intend to intend what we ended up intending, if that makes sense. We just had this thought. We don't choose to think our thoughts. The thoughts just appear in our consciousness and we recognize them. And to whatever extent those thoughts lead up to actions, They are simply a manifestation of those very thoughts that we had no control over. As Robert Sapolsky noted in his book called Determined, trying to analyze free will by only focusing on the action is like trying to analyze a movie based on only the last 3 seconds of the movie, because that's all the action is the final 3 seconds. Everything that preceded the action is what led to that action. So fundamentally speaking, this is the crux of what it means when we say that free will is an illusion. For the rest of this video, I want to dive into some counter arguments and different rabbit holes that might elucidate these points a little bit more. So let's try to compile just a few of these things that are beyond our control that we can actually notice. For one, there's culture. We don't get to choose which culture we grew up in and the influence that has on us. There's genes, there's microbiome, which is the bacteria in and around our body that affects different aspects of our physiology. There are our hormones, there are our parents and their genes, there are strangers we interact with, there is the climate, there's whether the temperature is cold or not. There are so many things, and all of these things play a role in whatever decision we and the people around us are making at any given point. And all of these things are so intertwined and playing off of each other that it's impossible to claim free agency over any decision that is independent of any one of those variables, let alone the infinite amount of variables that we're not even aware of, dating back to the Big Bang. The idea of free will gives the impression that if we were to go back in time, that somehow we would have been able to make a different decision than the one that we made. But thinking about it, we realize that if everything was exactly the way it was, if our genes were precisely as they were, our hormones, everyone around us, our environment, and all the interactions were precisely as they were at that very moment when we made that decision, we would make the exact same decision again because we would know no better than to make that decision. To go down that rabbit hole a little bit more, even if we came from the future and we actually know what happened in the future and want to change something, we still would have no control over how much that future knowledge influenced us to whatever degree it did to cause us to make whatever change in the past where our time machine brought us back to try to change. There's always a prior cause that was outside of our influence or even our knowledge. We don't know where these intents come from. We don't know where thoughts come from. They just burst out spontaneously onto the world, onto our minds. This idea of infinite regression, or a cause that was caused by something else that was caused by something else into infinity, is something that a lot of people are uncomfortable with because it highlights our ignorance in past events and how that very complex interaction of every circumstance led to our present moment. But infinite regress and lack of specific knowledge about a prior cause and the interactions that it's having with other causes is not an argument that free will exists. The fact that we can't map out every single cause does not leave room for us to take credit for anything that's going on around us and from us. Let's take Elon Musk, for example. He owns such influential companies. He is extremely wealthy. He's extremely influential. And to many people, Elon Musk is a quintessential self-made person. He is someone who basically picked himself up by the bootstraps. I'm sure we could come up with a better example as far as someone who picked themselves up by the bootstrap, but you get where this is going. Someone who actually worked for their success. And we compare that to, say, a janitor or someone who works at McDonald's, to use the stereotypical bad job. And what we realize is that both of these individuals' lives were filled with events that were beyond their control. Elon Musk did not choose to be born to the parents that he was born to. Neither did he choose not to be born 100 years prior to when he was born into a war-torn country or a place that did not have the technological infrastructure that he's been able to work off of to build himself up. He did not choose to have the genes that he had that made him as intelligent as he is to get to the level that he is, he did not choose to start learning whatever he started to learn that impressed upon him the way it did to get him to focus on whatever it is that he focused on. He did not choose any of that. He did not choose his parents. His parents did not choose their parents. So you see where this is going. It's going back to that idea that there is no uncaused cause. Everything that preceded Elon Musk's decisions that finally got him to where he's at today were preceded by something that was beyond his control, even up until the very present moment where he might be picking up an object, for example. That in itself is a concatenation of all the events that happened prior to that. In the same way, the janitor is a perfect sum of everything that happened in the background of his life. And none of these were things that he chose. All of these things aggregate to cause any present moment decision or any present moment circumstance that anybody might find themselves in. If we trade every factor in Elon Musk's life, and maybe not even all of them, just a good portion of them, and gave that to the janitor, we would have a completely different situation where the janitor would be Elon Musk, or maybe better, maybe a little worse, but they would be very different entities. And the point here isn't that Elon Musk was privileged and that's what got him to whatever position he's in. We can consider someone who was the least privileged person who finally became successful and realize that they too had no say over how resilient they were or how determined they were. They didn't have a say over when they came across that opportunity that they came across. The point is that there's always something prior that is beyond the control. This brings me to one of the knee-jerk reactions that people have against this idea that free will is an illusion. That is, it strips us away of credit for things that we've accomplished. But at the same time, it takes away retribution from people who did things that were wrong. Because if someone is not responsible for the decisions that they're making, then why should we blame them? And the implications of this are something that I will get to because I think they might be surprising in their own right. But needless to say, it's an idea that carries a lot of implications that makes it unsurprising that people are so resistant. There's this counter argument to free will that goes that if someone is born in a horrible condition, regardless of how their parents treated them or regardless of their environment that caused them to become whatever it is that they became, say a bad person, we can still blame that person because they've had ample time to make up for that deficit that they suffered in their childhood, for example. But the problem with this way of thinking is that bad circumstances don't tend to average out on the long run and put everybody on the same playing field. If anything, bad events tend to rack up because someone who is born in horrible conditions has all these mental stressors, they have problems socializing, they have financial problems that lead to bad decisions. You know, it's a snowball effect of bad decisions. So the idea that a grown person who's in an unfortunate situation had more than enough time to dig themselves out of that hole is akin to saying that someone who's a certain height in their adulthood has some control over how tall they're going to be, even if they did not have such control in the past. We know that is completely ridiculous. It's something that completely misses every subsequent event that led to that person being in that situation that they're in and the lack of control that that person had over all of those events. We can't just explain away every prior cause that led someone to be in the position that they're in by simply saying that, well, in this present moment, they get to make a different decision. Because whatever different decision that that might be is something that would have to emanate from every prior cause before that. Because we're not able to perfectly track every cause before it, we tend to take credit for whatever reaction that we have or whatever decision that we make. So If someone tells a joke that's funny and we laugh at it, it was through no conscious decision that it was just perfectly funny enough to make you laugh as opposed to crack a smile or maybe just laugh in your head or smile in your head. In fact, like any other display of emotion, a laugh or a smile is only genuine to the extent that it is not freely willed. A freely willed laugh would be akin to a fake laugh. And even that would not be freely willed because the impulse to fake a laugh is an impulse that we have no control over either. All that to say, we don't get to choose our intent and we don't get to choose the intensity at which we feel that intent. If the intent is intense enough to cause us to do something or to feel something or to want to puke, that's all beyond our control. Let's say I have a career decision to make and I decide that I'm going to give it a week or a month or however long you want it to be. That might give you the impression that I'm exercising my free will by giving myself ample time to come up with that conscious decision. But then we can observe that every prior thought that was influenced by my genetics, that was influenced by the environment, that all came together to cause me to make that final decision about my career was something that was beyond my control. It doesn't matter how long I take to make any decision because nowhere in that chain of events is there a gap for free will. At each step along the way, there are prior causes that are not coming from me, that are coming from, again, the summation of every event that happened prior to it. I want to conclude with the implications of free will that I alluded to earlier. It's unfortunate that I didn't talk about it much earlier in the video because in some ways it's really the most important takeaway from the idea that free will is an illusion. So I want to get straight to the point and say that taking on the idea that free will is an illusion liberates us from the blame game. We stop hating people. It's impossible to hate someone when we realize that they are precisely who they are because of no fault of their own. And we're more graceful with ourselves because we realize the same thing. There is this confusion, a common one, that, well, if someone is not responsible for their actions, then why should we put them in prison? What is the need for punishment? Are you saying we should just let criminals roam free because they're doing things through no fault of their own? And to address that, we need to understand the difference between change and the lack of free will, because these are two different things. The lack of free will is more of a description. It's not a prescription of how to be in the world. It's a description of how things are. And so change exists independently of that. If someone were to decide that because of my knowledge on free will being an illusion, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to sit in my room, because what's the point of making decisions if I'm not the one coming up with these decisions? Then even sitting in your room and not doing anything is a choice that you had no control over. It is merely a description of the situation we find ourselves in, that things react to different things and creates change. If we put a bad person in prison, that's going to deter other people from doing the same bad behavior, not through any choice of their own, but because that's just how people react to other people being put in prison. We're programmed to not want to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations, especially if we know how to avoid that by not doing what other people did to get themselves in those situations. So change is different from the idea that we lack free will. To go back to the implication of free will, it's not that we should live lives that are devoid from making any decisions. It's rather to give us that perspective that hatred of people who are making bad decisions around us is not the appropriate response to said decisions. There's actually this illustrative example about a shooter in the 1960s, Charles Whitman, who wrote a note before he went on his shooting spree saying that he felt like there was something wrong with him and that he recommended they looked into his brain whenever he died. And the autopsy showed a brain tumor that was very likely the reason why he was doing the things that he was doing. The rest of us need not have a brain tumor for doing anything, but the causes and effects are practically the same. It's brain tumors all the way down, as Sam Harris likes to say. We found a brain tumor is only indicative of the fact that we don't always know what it is that's causing a behavior, but nonetheless, there is something that exists that would be obvious to us if we were more knowledgeable. There are diseases like schizophrenia and seizures that people once used to think were, people being possessed by the devil or people doing acts that were completely inappropriate through their own volition. But then in time, we came to realize that no, they were actually pathologies that those people were suffering from through no fault of their own. And that was all as a result of building up our knowledge and understanding over millennia about what contributes to a certain behavior, but that is just the gist of what contributes to any person's behavior. Our physiology aside, which is a huge determinant, but yet one which we can't take responsibility for, there are all of these external factors that are also playing a part into whatever decision that we make. The idea that free will is an illusion really puts a damper on the idea that justice should be retributive as opposed to restorative. Because instead of punishing people under the pretext that we are somehow doing the right thing, when in fact we are simply trying to make ourselves feel better, we can focus more on what is actually effective in either getting the person's behavior to change or trying to keep the person away from other people who could be injured as a result of that person's behavior, which they have no control over. And this is an important point because when it comes to addressing other people, whether in our personal lives or as a society, we can pick from many different options as far as how to respond to less than ideal decisions that they make. We can choose to ascribe moral agency to that person and punish them accordingly, or we can see them as someone who is merely a victim of their circumstances, and that would in turn open up a different range of possibilities as far as how that person should be treated. And there are options that are a lot more compassionate than a lot of the other options that we resort to when we're trying to get back at people for things that we think they did to wrong us. In the same way, we don't attribute free will to volcanoes or hurricanes or earthquakes or even animals when we try to address whatever damage that they've caused in our lives. We should extend that perspective to other people because we're all a part of this causal world. The fact that we're humans does not preclude us from that chain of cause and reaction that embodies the world as we know it. The implications are also not just limited to bad behavior or how we respond to that, but also how we respond to bad ideas. Of course, that's not to say we shouldn't try to change bad ideas into better ones, but it gives us more of a sense of humility when dealing with other people's opinions. Instead of labeling them as horrible people because we don't agree with them, we can instead see them as products of their environment. If we had grown up in the exact same situation that they did, in their exact same bodies, we would have the exact same opinions that they do. So it gives us the desperately needed understanding to have public discourse, since violence is a very likely outcome when there is an inability or an unwillingness to have conversations about very consequential topics in society. I think this is a very beneficial perspective to have. In conclusion, the idea that free will is an illusion is not one that should fill us with dread and meaninglessness because now we can't take credit for our accomplishments, or now we don't get to blame other people for things that we feel they did to wrong us. Rather, it can actually be an empowering perspective in the way that it can broaden our compassion without really changing much in the way that we exist in this world. Again, we can still be amenable to change. We can still allow ourselves to grow and to learn from things that happened in our past, all the while seeing the beauty in being a product, every single one of us, of everything else that has come before it and that exists in the present moment, and the interactions that all of these things share to contribute to the precise person that we are in this given moment. I think that's beautiful.